Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. I recently did a podcast on high filter PSI, or the pressure on the filter being high, and I'm going to do a flip side podcast on low filter PSI, which is something that a lot of us experience out there. Besides it being high, we have the same problems, or we run into problems with the filter pressure or PSI being low. Pool Service Pro, open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro. Now, I mentioned with the high PSI that usually it's the filters the issue. It's impacted, it's dirty, the filter elements are bad. So what would cause low filter PSI? And how do you know if the filter PSI is low? Well, of course, the gauge on top will be an indicator, but you should also kind of know what the normal PSI of that pool is. So if you have 80 accounts, you're going to be familiar with each pool specifically eventually, and you would know that, oh, this pool is usually at 20 PSI when it's operating and it's only at 8. So there's definitely a problem. There are, of course, telltale signs at the equipment and at the pool that the PSI is low. One of them would be, of course, you're not getting a lot of suction. So if you open up the skimmer, take out the basket, and there's nothing being pulled into the skimmer, there's probably a problem with low PSI at that point. And it could be a number of reasons. Of course, I'll go over some of these here for you. You can also check the returns, and the return jets aren't really pushing out a lot of water. Maybe the spa spillway is just barely trickling in to the pool. That's an indicator that there's a problem with the flow and there's low flow to the pool. And by the way, the low flow can also be caused by high filter PSI because the water is not being pushed through the return lines because of the high PSI. But also with low PSI, the same thing happens with that. You may even see air bubbles coming out of the return line, so that indicates that there's probably air getting in there causing a low PSI, but I'll of course address that in a minute. And you're going to see, looking at the pump itself, now here's something that you have to be careful of, because if you have a variable speed pump and you're on low RPMs, sometimes the pump wet end or the pump pot doesn't fill entirely with water on really low RPMs. Usually it'll have some air in there in that case. And so this is something that is less of an indicator in some cases, depending on what kind of pump you have. If you have a single speed pump, the water should be filled all the way to the top in there. And so low PSI could be the fact that you're running at a lower RPM. So keep that in mind also as one of the indicators that can throw you off a little bit. So I always like to put it to the full RPM or full speed and then check it to make sure that it's not just on low causing the low PSI. Because if you're at 1800 RPMs, that pressure gauge will be at about 10 or 12 versus being at 20 because it's just not pulling at the full power, if that makes sense. So keep that in mind, that it's not really a problem, and it's something that's inherent in variable speed pumps, that you're going to have low filter PSI because it's not really pulling the water at the full 3450 RPMs. And if you have a pump that you suspect has low PSI and it's not filling all the way to the top of that pump pot or the wet end, then it could be an indicator of what is causing that problem. So of course, the first thing I suspect when there's low filter PSI is that there's something clogging the impeller of the pump. Now, this is not something that takes a lot of effort to fix. You don't have to take the pump off. Sometimes you can turn the back of the pump with an Allen wrench and free up the impeller. Sometimes you can what I like to do is put a flathead screwdriver in there and spin the impeller. Now, of course, I should prep you on this. You want to make sure that the pump is off, that it's not going to come back on. You can either turn the breaker off or just make sure that it's not going to come on by putting it in timeout mode or service mode on an automated panel. I prefer timeout mode because I've left pools in service mode on accident. And if you have a time clock, automatic time clock, open up that door and make sure that the little on tab is nowhere near going to be coming on within a minute or so, since you have the screwdriver in the impeller and you have the pump lid off and the basket. So the first thing you do is turn everything off. Then you want to take the lid off the pump, take the basket out, and then I use a flathead screwdriver and I'll spin the impeller. and it should spin fairly freely. I mean, it's not going to spin really freely, but you should be able to spin it. And more than not, when you're spinning out the screwdriver, you're going to hear some gurgling, and that indicates that there was probably something in there that was impacting the impeller and keeping it from spinning at the full speed. And what I do is I fill back, I put the basket in, I fill the pump up again. Sometimes there's a telltale sign. You'll look at the pump basket, it'll be torn. And this happens a lot here where we have a lot of grass around the pools, especially St. Augustine grass. It has a tendency to clog up the pump basket and tear a hole in the back of it and clog up the impeller. A lot of debris can actually go right through that pump basket into the impeller. The Pentair Whisper Flow is notorious for letting debris through the basket or cracking at that point because it's such a powerful pump. The basket probably is shaped not in the best fashion and usually pretty thin, the OEM factory baskets, and so they'll tear and debris will get into the impeller. And some pool pros use like a coat hanger. They'll create a tool that's kind of like bent a little bit, but I find the flathead screwdriver works perfectly fine in spinning it. So put everything back together, turn on the pump, and I can almost guarantee you that if it was a clogged impeller, the PSI will go from 10 up to 20 again, and that's your problem. You solved it. And this is very common. Very rarely will you have to take the motor off the pump and look at the impeller. It's not hard to do, it's just time consuming, but you can actually do that if you need to. Sometimes there's some debris that are like little pellets, almost like BBs. A lot of trees have these little seeds, and they'll get into the impeller and they'll get into the sides of the impeller and stop the impeller from spinning. So it's not very common, but you can take it off and inspect it. Of course, you want to inspect the impeller if you think maybe, there's something wrong with it or if it's broken. I've spun impellers before and they spin really freely, and then I really know at that point that, there's something wrong with the impeller. I'll take it off and I'll look at it, and usually it's cracked right where the screw's at, and that's what's causing it to spin freely. Sometimes it's cracked somewhere else. I'm not sure, maybe just stress cracks them over time. I would assume that's what it is, but I don't think that's a major issue. Usually it's just some debris stuck in there, and you can really tell by just taking the pump basket out and spinning that impeller with a screwdriver again, and then turning everything back on after you have everything back together. Another thing could be the pump basket itself. There are certain pumps where they can get clogged up. I find that the large Jandy pumps and the large Hayward pumps have that problem. They're a gigantic basket area, but any debris that gets right in front of the impeller will cause the pump not to run properly. And you'll see this with the Stealth pumps a lot. You have this basket that you can put groceries in. It's so big. They made this pump basket thinking that they're going to solve all the industry problems by making this gigantic pump basket, but it actually has an Achilles heel, which is the little area right in front of the impeller. If any debris gets in there, that gigantic pump pot or wet end is totally useless, and you're going to have your PSI down to like 6. And then I just simply take those baskets out, and then I kind of pound them on a cement to kind of dislodge all the stuff that's in there. You can, of course, rinse it with a garden hose. I don't really go that far. It's one of those things where just knocking it on the cement usually will dislodge all the debris. And then I put it back in there. So that's another cause, the pump basket itself. I mentioned the Whisper Flow also has that problem where all the debris will go by the impeller, especially if you have a lot of debris in your pool. One way to counter this is to have a filter saver, a skimmer sock in the skimmer basket. And I like these. They're like kind of like a cloth material that you put into the skimmer basket, and that way the fine particle debris can't go into the pump basket. I usually put a rock in there also to hold it down because it tends to float up with that skimmer filter saver skimmer sock in there, and that way you ensure that the skimmer basket stays down. A lot of times the skimmer basket will pop up a little bit, and that causes debris to get into the pump basket, causing this problem. The key here is to keep all the debris out of the pump basket in some fashion, either by putting a large brick in the skimmer basket to hold it down, getting a weighted skimmer basket, which they do make. They have some that have like this pole on top that the skimmer lid sits on that keeps it down. But the last thing you want is having a floating basket when the pool turns off, because then when the pool turns back on, a lot of debris gets sucked underneath that skimmer basket into the pump basket. So to avoid kind of low PSI because of the impeller being impacted by debris or the pump basket being impacted by debris, you want to make sure that no debris gets into the pump basket by having that filter saver in the skimmer basket, having an automatic suction side cleaner with a canister. I wouldn't recommend the Hayward the Hayward canister, the W560. That's the one with the plastic mesh insert. And by the way, they changed that to black plastic, which was totally crazy because now you can't visually inspect that. This is a little sidetrack here and a pet peeve. It used to be a light gray one, and you can actually look into that canister for your suction cleaner and see that there was debris in there. But since they changed it to a black insert, it's hard to see if there's debris in there, which is really annoying. But this is not the one I would recommend if your pump basket is getting debris, because that means it's passing right through this canister. The canister I would recommend would be their larger canister, which is the W530 or the Pentair leaf trap. Anything with a fine mesh bag in there will help prevent debris from getting into the pump basket, causing the system to run poorly. So that's your first line of defense, and that's usually the first issue with low PSI, the pump basket or impeller. A secondary issue that I find very common and something, there was this one pool, I remember this, and I was kind of new to the business, new to the industry, and I was just troubleshooting it because, I couldn't get a full prime. I wanted to vacuum the pool, and it just wasn't priming up, and I was spending so much time there, like, what's wrong with this thing, and turning valves, emptying out the pump basket, looking for air leaks. I was just spending so much time, and I was like, well, maybe, it's just the lid O-ring. I mean, it looks like it's fine. The O-ring looks fine, but let me lube it up really good, and I'll put it back on and see if that solves the problem. This is like 15 minutes later, I decided to do this, and I did that, and the pump fired up completely right away, and I was able to vacuum the pool, and I was really upset at myself. I did like a backwash of the filter. I was doing all these things, and it was just simply the O-ring was just not sealing properly. This happens a lot, and this is something that should be your second thing to do and not like your fifth or sixth thing to do. So after I checked the impeller, I checked the pump basket, and it's still not working. A lot of times this will be very apparent if you have like a Pentair WhisperFlow, and you take that pump lid off and the O-ring just falls off onto the ground. It's worn out at that point. The WhisperFlow O-ring should stick to the clear lid part. It shouldn't fall right out. Other pump lids are a little bit harder to diagnose, and you just have to really kind of, visually inspect them and change the O-ring. So I have in my truck, I carry this container. I think I have a video where I show everything I carry in my truck. I don't remember what it's called on YouTube, but I do have this container, this clear container full of O-rings, and I have them in Ziploc bags, and I have them with the pump name on them specifically. So I'll have a bag marked WhisperFlow. I'll have a bag marked, Stay Right Duraglass. I'll have another one marked Jandy, Stealth, or whatever. And I'll have all these lid O-rings because I've learned from experience that this is the number 2 problem that you run into, that pump lid O-ring is really the only way that air can get into the pump, because they have the O-ring there so you can get a seal and remove that lid to clean it. And so logically, removing that lid over and over again wears out that O-ring, stretches it even slightly, and a little bit of a stretch there will cause air to get into the pump. And if air gets into the pump, it's not going to pull the water properly because it has to be a completely sealed system. I probably should have described this a little earlier, but your pump works only if it's completely sealed, which means that only water is in there. If any air gets in there, it's going to cause the pump not to work properly. The air fights against the water in a way to where it's not going to pull. It needs to be basically zero air getting into the pump, I should say, for it to work properly. So the O-ring on top is something that you want to address. You can even lube up an old one sometimes and get it working like I did, but changing it is probably the best thing you can do. And I use Magic Lube on the O-rings. I find even though it's messy, it's probably the best way to seal that O-ring. Just don't drop that lid on the ground, because then that Magic Lube will pick up all that dirt and you're going to spend time rinsing off that lid. But that would be the second thing I would look at. And then the third thing that I would look for is some kind of air leak. And this is pretty common if the pool were to get low on water and run dry for an hour or two. Now there are 2 areas where the air can get into the pump, and this is through the threaded fittings that's, in the front of the pump. It's not really something that's plumbed directly in. There's threaded fittings on top and on the front of the pump. Sometimes you can't see them because they're threaded completely in, and it looks like that the pump is actually, a solid plumbed in with a PVC cement, but it's not. There's actually threads there. So what happens if the pump gets hot, I should say, from not having water, and it gets really hot in there, by the way. If you've been doing this long enough, you'll have like the shrunken head pump baskets. It looks like those African shrunken heads that they wear around their neck, but it's actually the pump basket. And I've seen WhisperFlow pump baskets that were the size of like a small styrofoam cup. They shrunk down that much from the heat of the pump. So it gets really hot from not having water in there. And this will actually melt the threads slightly on the threaded part of the intake and outtake of the pump. I should probably use technical terms. And this will let air in there. And just that small, minuscule amount of air getting in there will cause the pump not to prime. Now, my go-to trick, and this is something that's harder in California because you can't really find these bags anymore. But if you go to I don't know if there's 99-cent stores anywhere anymore, but you want these cheap plastic grocery bags, ones you can tear easily. So I'll tear a grocery bag and I'll wrap it around the threaded part of the inlet, sometimes the threaded part of the outlet, and I'll tie it really tight on there. It looks tacky, I understand this, but it stops the air from getting in there because the plastic kind of seals that threaded part, and then you can prime the pump up fine. I have a video on YouTube where I show you this trick, and of course, we can't get these cheap bags as readily in California because they're pretty much banned and you have to pay for bags, and the bags that you get are thicker plastic. But these cheap thin bags, Home Depot is one, I can say this, Home Depot has these bags still. So if you go to Home Depot, you can get some of these cheap thin bags and you can use those to seal air leaks in the inlet and outlet by wrapping it really tightly, tearing the bag, wrapping it tightly, and tying it. You can also use industrial grade electrical tape, not your standard electrical tape, but if you go to a supplier that has, industry standard tape, it's kind of thicker like duct tape. This works really well also to seal the inlet and outlet. It looks cleaner too, and it's something that I've used as well. And this is something that is effective. But air gets in there from the pump overheating usually. That's usually the number one cause of this. And if you have unions with O-rings in there, the pump gets hot enough to really damage those O-rings. I've seen it, especially if the union is pretty close to the pump. The heat will dissipate and go out to the top of the pump. And I've unscrewed these unions on top before, and the O-ring, the O-ring is pretty much ruined at that point. So you definitely want to put a new O-ring in the unions and lube it up and put it together. That should solve the problem. I've also seen unions come loose. This could be from just vibration. Used to be in the old days, we would bolt the pump down onto the equipment pad, and they actually have spots for those bolts on the pump. If you see them, there's little cutouts, and you can bolt them down, and you're supposed to bolt them down, but no one does anymore. And so sometimes there's vibration from the equipment, from the pump on the equipment pad, and that causes those unions just to come undone slightly, enough to where you just grab it with your hand and tighten it, and that solves the problem. So that would be my number 3 area that I would look for, is that you would have a problem with the unions and O-rings. Now I should say that number 4 can be number 1 also, and it can be number 2, but I keep it at number 4 because you should notice this right away anyway, and that is low water in the pool or the weir gate being stuck in the skimmer. So there's a weir gate usually in most pools. As they get older, sometimes they get stuck in the closed position, not letting the water get into the skimmer. And it should be pretty obvious for you when you get to the pool if this is the problem, especially low water. If there's low water, it's not going to prime up and you're not going to have any way to get the pump running properly. But if it's a weir door that's stuck in the skimmer, if the water level is fine but it's still not pulling, the weir door should be something that you check. But you should discover this when you're emptying the skimmer basket and you're checking for the problem with the pump basket being impacted with debris. Usually I make sure I check the skimmer basket to make sure that it's not floating or that that's not the problem. Sometimes the skimmer basket has a giant crack in it. I've been at pools before where the skimmer basket is missing. I'm like, what happened to the skimmer basket? I don't know what happened. The kids were playing with it or something, but there's no skimmer basket in there and all the debris goes into the pump. But the weir gate is also a factor. So check that, and you can move that again up from 4 to 1 or 2 depending on what you want to do. But I usually check that when I'm checking for the problem with the pump basket or impeller. I'll make sure that the weir gate is actually opening and letting water through to the skimmer. Those are the primary things that you want to look for. And then it gets kind of weird after that. You can have something stuck in the plumbing. You can have something stuck in the Jandy valve. You've seen pictures on Facebook where someone took the Jandy valve apart in front of the pump and they show a picture of it full of debris. That happens, but that's because something happened with the skimmer basket that lets debris in there. Or you have an automatic suction side cleaner without a canister letting debris in there, causing that. I've had weird things like t-shirts in the skimmer line, water balloons, all of these clog up the skimmer line. Not something that really is common, so this is further down the list. And then, of course, an impacted skimmer. This is way down on the list, but it does happen where the skimmer line is compromised and you can't get suction. So these are like things that aren't very common, but can happen. You can have something in the line causing that to clog up. Sometimes it's something really simple like a kid's toy in the skimmer. Sometimes something gets under the skimmer basket and the customer just puts everything back in like nothing. And I've had this happen before where I get to a pool, nothing's running, and I take out the skimmer basket and underneath there is a thermometer stuck in the skimmer. I'm like, well, obviously that got sucked in there. The customer just put the skimmer basket on top of it or whatever. It's like, let me know there's something wrong. And that's kind of something that happens once in a while. And I guess one last thing that could cause this problem is that your automatic cleaner connected to a canister, which I recommend having a suction cleaner and a canister. There's an O-ring in that canister lid as well. So this is pretty obvious too. It's not something that you have to put on the list, but this is something that primarily you should see right away, is that when you have the pool running, you'll see the suction cleaner pulling water. You'll see the canister float up and go back down and float up. The pool will prime, it'll lose its prime. The pressure gauge will go from 5 to 20 back to 5. And that's because that canister is compromised. Could be an automatic cleaner hose compromised also. I've had raccoons chew hoses and I don't notice it until the cleaner is turning a certain way or getting to some point of the pool where the hose comes up a little bit. But you can have cleaner hoses compromised with suction cleaners, but normally the canister itself is compromised with the O-ring letting air in there. So there's, a number of reasons why this could happen, why you have low filter PSI, but I think the main reasons are something before the pump affecting it, the pump itself, the impeller, the pump lid, and all the things I described here are the steps you should take to find the problem. And one of these should solve the low PSI problem for you, with your particular situation. And of course, something unusual may be happening, but usually it's something that's usual and fixable. If you're looking for other podcasts I've recorded, you can find those on my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. Just click on the podcast icon and there'll be about 1,500 podcasts for you to listen to. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. Real quick, if you're not using pool service software, try Skimmer free for 30 days at getskimmer.com/poolguy. Again, that's getskimmer.com/poolguy. Skimmer, everything you need to run your pool service business all in one app. Pool Service Pro. Open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro.